I'm going to go straight over to James Putzel, who's the director of a crisis states research group. And can I borrow this for a second? This is he wrote a famous conference report, famous in the media development community, called "Why Templates for Media Development Do Not Work in Crisis States," which I recommend. I disagree with it, but I recommend it. And it's a really it's quite challenging and has actually been responsible. It was a consequence of a conference or workshop with the Annenberg School of Communication, but actually really sharpened up a lot of thinking, and really in relation to a lot of the organisations working on media development and media freedom. It actually has, although a lot of us didn't agree with it when it came out in 2005, it really did reshape a lot of the way in which we were working, approaching these issues. But James, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to ODI and thanks, James. I can only speak really in very staccato terms because we don't have much time. So I want to actually put some points, and I'd be happy to try to prove them in the discussion. I can't provide you with all the evidence now. My starting point, first of all, in talking about this issue, is that the premise is that we need states. States are necessary to regulate economic, social life, to also ensure and guarantee rights, like rights to media freedom. That's one starting assumption. And second point I want to make is that in today's established OECD countries, where there are liberal democratic political systems and market economies, almost to a country, they did not develop with free mass medias. Okay, that's the first point. Secondly, media. I mean, media, we've already heard about the technological changes, the set of technologies and organizations that allow the dissemination of information and the influencing of opinion. These make up very powerful tools, and those tools can be used to promote peace. For instance, we know the role of Radio Okapi in the Eastern DRC, very positive in that sense, or promote violence, like Radio Midkalin in Rwanda and the story of the genocide, and we need to restate these things. Media can be either constitutive of the state, in a role that media probably played in Uganda post-86 in quite an important way, radio especially, or it can contribute to state unraveling and destruction, which I would argue that it has done in a number of crisis states situations. There's a fundamental tension, and the other speakers have actually spoken to it, in the relationship of the role media plays in the evolution of democracy or democratic political systems. And that's the contradiction between private ownership of media, accentuated in the age of liberalization, and the role of, which means that media can be monopolized and can be manipulated to personalist and particularist interests, and the role of media as third estate, as a check on abuses of state power, as a watchdog. So what's guaranteed historically, the more positive role of media, has been regulation, has been talked about, the assurance of competition in that privately owned sector, but even more importantly, the development of the ethics of professional journalism, for instance, which is a product of civil society. Civil society allows professionals, whether they're lawyers in the judiciary sector, or whether they're engineers in technical sector, or whether they're journalists, the development of a civil society associational space has been extremely important for standards of behavior. And by definition, in poor countries, and particularly in fragile states, which are a subset of poor countries, and I'll mention what subset they are in a moment, this is particularly difficult. Civil society is often just projected in as a donor-funded island rather than real civil society sector. So those are really fundamental aspects of media. In fragile states, we're talking about a particular group of states. Not all poor countries are fragile. So we've come to define them very, very particularly, and essentially define around states that are particularly vulnerable to conflict, where security has not been guaranteed by the state, where there are non-state challengers to security, and the population is subject to arbitrary violence, either by non-state perpetrators of violence or by the state armed coercive forces themselves. That's an essential characteristic of a fragile state. Also, where the state's territorial reach is limited and doesn't reach significant parts of the population and significant areas where wealth is produced. Thirdly, where there exists alternative or rival authorities that raise taxes and revenue to challenge the state's monopoly of doing that. And fourthly, and importantly for media, where state institutions or laws don't trump rival institutions and laws. In other words, where the state's own regulatory powers, in fact, are extremely limited, where either the institutions of traditional authorities or regional power brokers or warlords or whatnot compete with the state. So, in other words, situations of important institutional multiplicity. Now, in our own research on fragile states, we see really what has driven this, and I should just say, and the opposite of fragile state is a resilient state, and it can be a poor state, but it's one where these basic characteristics of the state have been assured. Two of the examples we've done work on are Zambia and Tanzania, for instance, in contrast to, say, Afghanistan and the Democratic Republic of Congo as extremes of resilience and fragility. Now, what we would argue is that what really drives these patterns of fragility and resilience is political organization. Political organization has made all the difference. And this is particularly the political organization of elite interests in the first place, because the elites are those who command resources and therefore also command constituencies or society. So political organizations are very much wrapped up in elite affairs. And why do political organizations, how do they impact on different characteristics of the state, is essentially through the kind of executive authority they put up. So to be very simple, just to put the proposition on the table, because we're talking about fragile states, an executive authority has to be powerful enough, have enough power in its hands to be able to exercise both positive and negative incentives on elites to play by state rules. Okay? So they have to have enough power in their hands to protect property rights of elites, rents of elites, etc., but also punish elites who will deviate from the rules that apply to everybody. The other characteristic of political organization that's essential in this regard is what mechanisms exist to limit abuses of that executive authority. And essentially they can be of two types. They can be internal veto points within the political organization. That is, you have sections of the organization, et cetera, who determine what the executive can and can't do, that represent different interests. Or they can be third-party enforcers outside of the political organization. Say, for instance, Zambia, the trade union movement, very important for limiting abusive powers of the state over time. So if we think about it in relationship to media, there is potentially a very important role of third-party enforcer in a media that is genuinely, has some independence and some integrity. In fragile states, so the pattern of the way politics is contested is extremely important in relationship to what kind of attitude external actors, et cetera, can take towards media. Because the more that politics is contested as a zero-sum game, is where one group wins, the other loses completely. Say, for instance, when land is allocated by ethnicity, by a traditional authority, a tribe, and all sorts of others are excluded, rather than now being allocated through access to a tenancy agreement, et cetera, that divides the produce of the land. When voting means that, one minority group can be ultimately totally excluded, the hands of a majority vote, then in these sorts of situations, the less likely media is going to be able to play a constructive role in terms of securing both peace and promoting state building. Yeah? Unless somehow the media is able to contribute to redrawing the terms of conflict in that society, to non-zero sum types of conflict. And we could talk about this. So since I have so little time, I want to make just a few points of conclusion and also policy proposition. So just 3 points of conclusion. First of all, the freedom of media like all the rights we talk about, whether right to work, right to health, right to can only be achieved incrementally. They can only be achieved incrementally, and there'll always be a process of tit-for-tat struggle between society that tries to expand the rights of media and social groups, or the rights in general, including media ones, and the state that needs to guarantee rights and also maintain order. That's first. Second, it can be legitimate for a state to curtail or limit media freedom. I would add within limits. That's what the debate is about, what limits. But it can be legitimate for a state to curtail or limit media freedoms when the alternative is violence or state unraveling. Yeah? And thirdly, it's important, there's in the important role of political organization in relationship to state building, media can play this part of third-party enforcer in limiting executive authority. What does that all mean for policy? Well, let me make just 4 observations about this. The first thing is that it is never, because we have donors in the title, what should donors do to improve things? It is never appropriate for donors to promote media freedom or push media projects without understanding the political processes of a place. Never. So that's a kind of principle of do no harm. That's the first. Secondly, because the media is contingent, its role is context-specific in relation to the potential impact it can play on peace and on state building, it's inappropriate to use kind of the degree of media freedoms as a measure of state performance. It's not appropriate. It can measure all sorts of things. It can measure how much democracy there is or there isn't, but it's not an appropriate measure about state performance. Thirdly, donors can almost always support the improving or the expansion of this professional dimension of journalism, the associational space for the development of ethical standards among journalists. And I think there's a lot of James's BBC World Service Trust work that shows that, the Stanhope organization, et cetera. There's lots of experience about that. So there is a big role for donors in that regard. And donors can almost always also contribute to third-party enforcement in a way, in the sense of promoting the idea, the aspiration, that independent media, pluralist and responsible, is a source of legitimacy. And so donors have a big role, I think, to play in that regard as well, where there is reasonable pressure exercised to work towards incrementally improving and opening the ground for media. So let me stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, James. There's going to be a whole bunch of questions, I think, in response to that, I'm sure, and I won't try and answer a lot of them, particularly in relation to the issues around media freedom, because I imagine there'll be quite a few questions from the floor around that. But can I just ask 2 questions right now? I mean, one is, what you are suggesting is that there is a policy choice here, that there is actually, not just by donors, but also by governments, but in the interests of state stability, in the interests of maintaining sustainable political settlements, the interests of creating an environment for elite bargains to work their way through, that there are good arguments to limit media freedom, and that the consequences of not doing so, at least in some society, could be catastrophic. I think it's a sort of very, very primitive summary of some of what you're saying. The one issue, though, is that a policy choice? I mean, in an age where there is ubiquitous access to mobile telephony, increasing access to media in one form or another, is it actually realistic to try and limit media freedom in a lot of the countries in which we're talking about? And forget about the desirability for a moment, which I think is another huge issue, but just one of the, is this an actual possibility? And if it's not, then presumably we're in a very different stage of a discussion.
Very quick answer to that, and we can debate it a lot more. I have a lot to say about the technological changes in media and how it affects things. But I think the point to make here is that in an absolute sense, you're right. No. I mean, we operate with porous boundaries now, and I think the introduction of Anya's point about technological change is absolutely important. Nevertheless, different media technologies permit the dissemination of information and the influencing of opinion to differing degrees in different societies, whether they're rural, distant, peripheral societies, and in urban areas. So that's the first thing. There's a differential impact. And secondly, I talked about limiting, not prohibiting. So, and if you would look even today at, countries that we would say are, at the very least, semi-democratic, like Malaysia, or countries that are really growing fast and are relatively peaceful, like China. Of course, there is the impact of telecommunications, access to internet, but they're curbed. They're curbed, and if you take a country like Rwanda, of course there is growing access to the internet in the population, but still media freedoms are curbed or limited there. So I think there is a range of policy intervention here towards, complete laissez-faire and openness to certain forms of regulation, intervention, limitation. And what I argued was that there are grounds when it's justifiable to limit.
Okay, I've got lots more questions, but we'll come back to it. We'll come back to this.